I've been thinking this past week of a popular film from the 90s called Hope Floats, a film I reckon many of you might remember. The film stars Sandra Bullock and Harry Connick Jr., and it's ultimately about a young woman's struggle to rebuild her life in her small Texas hometown. Now, as much that I could say about this film, as it really is a moving and entertaining story, but I bring the film up this morning because there's one scene in it that has been on my mind this week. In the scene, a little boy named Travis, who is the son of Bullock's character's estranged sister, he's a little boy who has been raised for years by his grandmother. In the scene, the little boy's grandmother has just died. A telegram has recently come to the house saying that his mother will not be coming home for the funeral. And so in the scene, the little boy, probably 8 or 9 years old, is sitting on the front porch of his grandmother's house, processing the loss of the only mother figure he's ever known, processing the reality that his own mother is never going to come back for him, and all the while watching people come and go from the house to attend to other grieving family members, such as Sandra Bullock's character. Well, here in this scene, the little boy there on the porch, obviously heartbroken, but trying to hold it all together. Here he is on the porch when Harry Connick Jr.'s character, who has been quietly courting Sandra Bullock's character throughout the film, when Harry Connick Jr.'s character arrives at the house and walks up to the front porch and sits down beside this young boy, and the little boy says sadly, "Aunt Bertie's inside." To which Harry Connick Jr.'s character looks the boy in the eye and says, "Don't you know? I've come here to see you. Don't you know? I've come here to see you." 25 years later, I still tear up thinking about that scene. Let's switch gears for a minute. I want to talk quickly about a famous theological concept, one called Pascal's wager. Named for 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal, Pascal's wager is commonly understood as this: that if there is indeed a God, then one is obviously wise to believe in God and to live in light of that belief, but that if there is not a God, then nothing is lost by believing in him and living as if he did exist. Thus, the wager, people commonly think, refers to the inherent wisdom in betting on God's existence. But here's the thing. That's not really what Pascal wrote. Instead, Pascal's wager is about something far deeper and more profound than that. You see, Blaise Pascal, who spent the first half of his life chasing happiness in every possible way and form that he could, Pascal eventually came to realize that nothing that he ever gained or achieved in this life ever really satisfied him. And thus what he concluded was that his experiences of happiness, though indeed wonderful, were nonetheless fleeting. Meanwhile recognizing that his baseline human experience was that of quiet, abiding sorrow, sadness, grief. And so then, as a person of Christian faith, Pascal decided that the best thing that he could possibly do, given this existential reality, was to face his abiding sorrow and pray for the consolation of Jesus amid it. And thus, Pascal's wager, if you go and read his famous Pensées, the book in which the wager is featured, Pascal's wager is really this: the wager that if we will stop trying to hide our sadness and our grief from ourselves and from others, And if we will instead face it head on and bring it before God in prayer, then the risen Jesus will indeed show up to console us when and how we least expect it. That is the wager. Leading me now to John chapter 11. In John chapter 11, Jesus' friend Lazarus has just died. And by the time that Jesus arrives on the scene, ostensibly 4 days late, Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, each greet Jesus by mournfully saying, "Lord, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened." Lord, if you had been here, they say, then this wouldn't have happened. At which point, something heartbreakingly beautiful happens. Jesus, God incarnate, begins to weep. Looking there at his dead friend Lazarus, seeing the tears and the grief of all the friends and family gathered, hearing Mary and Martha's mournful words, overwhelmed by it all, Jesus, God incarnate, in John chapter 11, begins to weep alongside them. This sermon series, of which today's sermon is number 5 of 6, this series has been about the kind of culture that we hope to continue to cultivate here at Boulevard. And importantly, the whole series has sought to root our vision in the biblical picture of the coming kingdom of God, so that what we cultivate here might be a foreshadowing, might be an anticipation of that glory which is to come. And so in light of that hope, let us look at St. John's language describing the state of things in God's glorious kingdom come. God himself will be with them, John writes. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. Oh, dear family, can you even imagine a reality with no more pain? No more crying. No more mourning. I had a friend call me not long ago, a pastor friend from North Carolina. And this friend, it's important you understand, is one of the cheeriest, happiest people I know. But on the day he called me, he said something to me that surprised me and that has stuck with me ever since. He said, I was driving home from a conference the other day, and I was trying to figure out what this emotion was that I'd been struggling with for several days, and suddenly, he said, it hit me like a fist. I realized that I was sad. I want y'all just to sit with that story for a second. This friend of mine, a cheerful, overly positive, always upbeat guy, was surprised to realize that lurking just underneath his existential hood was a profound and nearly debilitating sadness. And I ask us, can we not all relate? Do we not, when we are most awake to and most aware of ourselves, do we not all struggle with a deep and abiding sense of sadness? Time marches on. Things change. Children grow. Loves ebb and flow. And all the while uncertainty lurks and chaos threatens. And the future overwhelms and the present mystifies. And none of this is even to speak of the specific sorrows and struggles and tragedies and traumas that we each face throughout our individual lives. Yes, if we are honest with ourselves, ours is much of the time as human beings a sad existence. And compounding this reality, which in the final analysis is simply another way of saying we are human, but compounding this all too human reality is this all too contemporary fact. Ours is a time wherein we feel like we're supposed to present ourselves as always and ever happy, right? As if our identities depend upon it. Our worth as human beings, our ability to keep up with the flows of things. If you take a look around, you'll see appearing happy is among our society's highest goods. Make sure and post it. It used to be that being a person of character was a high good, societally speaking. Or being a person of unshakable faith was a high good. Or even being simply successful in one's vocation was a high good. But today, far higher of a good than things such as these is simply presenting ourselves to others as being happy. As having it together, as winning in the game of life. And please hear me say, there is nothing wrong at all with being happy. God knows we could all use a little more of it. But the point is this: to be human in a broken world is, in its very essence, to be, much if not most of the time, unhappy, frustrated, overwhelmed, uncertain, off balance, grieving, existentially sad. Leading me back now to Blaise Pascal. What Pascal eventually realized was that which he had been chasing, in other words, constant happiness, Pascal realized that this would always remain elusive. And it would always remain elusive, Pascal realized, because the conditions of reality are such that on this side of that eternal tomorrow, permanent happiness is an impossibility for human beings. And so then Pascal wagered that if he'd just be honest with himself about this, and more importantly, if he'd just be honest with God about it, then perhaps the risen Jesus, a man well acquainted with sorrow and grief himself, a man who had tasted the very depths of sorrow and grief and had risen from the dead on the other side of it, perhaps, Pascal wagered, this risen Jesus would then show up to console him when and how he least expected it. If you had been here, Mary and Martha said to Jesus, this wouldn't have happened. Dear family, how often do we feel this way ourselves? How often do we feel like if God really cared, if God really were with us, then those things that have brought us such profound sorrow and griefs in our lives would never have happened? I know I've thought that. Perhaps many times. And that's why John chapter 11 is a story that offers us such profound comfort. For in this story, we see that even though God in the person of Jesus did not intervene to stop the event that brought such grief to Mary and Martha and others, still the awareness of their grief brought tears to his eyes, and he came and he sat with them in it. Dear family, the part of John chapter 11 that I want us to focus on today is not the miraculous resuscitation of Lazarus that takes place at the end of the story when Jesus says, "Lazarus, come out," but is instead the miraculous consolation that comes in the middle of the story. When Jesus comes to Mary and Martha in the midst of their sorrow and begins to cry alongside them. Because here is the thing, dear family. Here in the middle of the story, which is to say, here on this side of that eternal tomorrow, this is the way that Pascal's wager works. It's not a wager on God's miraculous intervention before any and all grief. It's a wager on Jesus' tender and abiding consolation amid it. Which is to say, the wager on this side of God's kingdom come is that if we will come to God honestly and openly with our grief and our sorrow, and if we will stop striving for unmitigated happiness and stop pretending like we are always cheerful and upbeat, then the risen Jesus will show up for us when and how we least expect it. Showing up for us like Harry Connick Jr.'s character did for that young boy. Showing up for us when all hope seems to be lost. Sidling up to us and whispering, "Don't you know? Don't you know? I've come here to see you." Dear family, as we continue to cultivate the kind of culture we want here at Boulevard, let us endeavor to make this a sanctuary wherein we can vulnerably confess to God and to one another our abiding sadness and grief as human beings. Let us endeavor to make our church family one where we can vulnerably share with one another how we really feel. And trust that we don't need to present a false image in order to be welcome here and to be accepted. And let's do this not only because it's a good thing to do, but let's do this because we know that this is the reality that we are all ultimately bound for. Yes, in anticipation of that grand, glorious day which is to come, let us endeavor on this day to trust that here and now, right here in the middle of the story, the risen Jesus will show up to us in our sadness, often via the presence of one another. Yes, so much so that when we least expect it, we will find ourselves wiping one another's tears and bearing one another's burdens in the name of the risen Christ Jesus. Yes, let us wager. Let us wager that if we will indeed create a space in which we can all be true to ourselves and true to one another, then the risen Jesus will indeed show up. Most often in the faces and the words and the love of one another. And that in advance of the grand act of resurrection that awaits us all at the end, the risen Jesus will for now simply sit down beside us and will weep along with us and will console us in our grief and reassure us of the glory yet to come, all the while reminding us that hope, if we will truly face our sadness, really can and really will always float to the top. And all God's people said,